The call reached emergency services just after 11:30 a.m., a quiet Friday morning in North London. The dispatcher heard panic, but not the kind she expected. The young mother on the line insisted her baby wasn't breathing. Her sentences were fractured by sobs, but there was an odd steadiness underneath, a tone that didn't match the urgency of the words. Within minutes, an ambulance was dispatched to a modest flat on Hermitage Road, a building known more for noise complaints than medical crises. As the paramedics stepped inside, the first thing that hit them was a smell, thick, sour, unmistakable, a mix of waste, decay, and something older that clung to every surface. They moved through the flat, past piles of clothes and scattered debris, and found the child lying in a small cot near the wall. He was motionless, pale, wearing only a nappy. One paramedic leaned over him, already aware of what the coldness of his skin meant. The rigidity in his limbs confirmed what no one wanted to say aloud. The mother hovered nearby, shaking and unfocused. When told they needed to take her son to the hospital, she paused, then quietly asked if she could take her cigarettes with her. The crew exchanged glances, confused, unsettled, not because of the words themselves, but because of the world they were standing in. By the time they reached North Middlesex Hospital, the medical staff tried, for the sake of protocol, one last attempt at resuscitation. It changed nothing. At 12:19 p.m., the baby was formally pronounced dead, a child who barely had a name beyond a handful of official records. But within hours, his name, Peter Connolly, would ignite one of the most uproarious public reckonings the United Kingdom had ever seen. The discovery inside the flat triggered an immediate investigation. What appeared at first glance to be a sudden medical tragedy showed signs of something darker. Detectives arriving at the scene were struck by details the paramedics had noted. The filth inside the home, the bruises visible on the child's body, the absence of any sign that this had been a natural death. The mother, Tracy Connolly, was taken into custody for questioning. Meanwhile, two men connected to the household, her boyfriend, Stephen Barker, and Barker's brother, Jason Owen, vanished before officers arrived. What investigators soon learned was that Peter had not simply slipped through the cracks. He had been dragged through them. Over the next days, hospitals, clinics, and social service offices across London were contacted for records. Each call returned the same unsettling message. Yes, we've seen this child before. The deeper detectives dug, the more staggering the pattern became. Peter had interacted with the healthcare and welfare system over 60 times in just 17 months. He had been examined by doctors, evaluated by nurses, reviewed by pediatric specialists, and visited by social workers. He had been flagged as at risk, removed temporarily for safety, then returned. His case had been debated in meetings, noted in files, and discussed among professionals who believed they were following protocol. Yet at every point where his trajectory could have changed, it hadn't. To understand how that happened, investigators began tracing his story backwards, to the beginning. Tracy Connolly's early years laid the foundation for everything that followed. Born in 1981 in Leicester to a mother overwhelmed by instability, she grew up in a home marked by emotional neglect and frequent upheaval. Her biological father had disappeared early, and the men who came after often brought disorder rather than support. By her adolescence, Tracy's life had already attracted the attention of social services, with reports describing a child starved for structure and affection. By 16, she entered a relationship with an older railway worker, a man twice her age. The relationship moved quickly, a marriage, then children, each pregnancy adding new pressure to a home that was already stretched thin. She wanted a stable family, something she had never known, but her attempts were undermined by depression, financial strain, and a growing dependence on online escapism. Her partner eventually left, unable to withstand the constant turbulence. Then came Peter, born in March 2006. For a brief moment, it seemed Tracy's life might stabilize. Those around her remembered seeing her affectionate with him during the early months. She called him my smiley boy, showing off photos that painted a hopeful picture. But beneath that veneer was a woman carrying unresolved trauma, unaddressed mental health struggles, and a desperate need to feel chosen by anyone willing to stay. That vulnerability paved the way for Stephen Barker, a man with his own troubled past. He appeared helpful at first, fixing small things around flat, offering companionship, but his history told a different story. He grew up in Tottenham under circumstances marked by violence, cruelty, and a disturbing fascination with domination. Former acquaintances later described him as volatile, easily provoked, and prone to harming animals. He kept weapons around him as symbols of power and often acted under the influence of his older brother, Jason, whose own criminal past was defined by intimidation and exploitation. Within weeks of meeting Tracy, Barker had embedded himself into her home. Officially, he did not exist there. Tracy continued claiming benefits as a single mother. Unofficially, he had complete access to her children, full control over the environment, and a growing influence on Tracy that left her increasingly isolated. By the time social services conducted routine checks, Barker's presence had been concealed or downplayed. Tracy smiled through visits, offered plausible explanations, and maintained the appearance of cooperation. The home was occasionally messy, but not outwardly dangerous. The children were unkempt, but not visibly harmed. Each professional noted concerns, but not enough concerns, never enough for anyone to take decisive action. Yet Peter's injuries told a different truth. From the time he was 6 months old, he began showing signs of repeated harm, bruises, swelling, unexplained marks. Tracy's story shifted. He fell, he tumbled, the dog knocked him over. Doctors documented these accounts without challenge, and early concerns fizzled into routine appointments. Even when a pediatrician raised the alarm in December 2006, advising that Peter should not be returned home without protective measures, the urgency dissolved in procedural delays. He was placed temporarily with a family friend, recovered, thrived, and then was returned. It was one of many irreversible decisions. As investigators pieced together the timeline after his death, a chilling truth emerged. Peter's environment had deteriorated drastically in the months leading to that August morning. By mid-2007, the flat held 11 people, Tracy, 4 of her children, Barker, Jason's teenage girlfriend, and her 3 children. Several large dogs roamed freely. The home was overcrowded, chaotic, increasingly unsanitary. Neighbors reported foul smells, arguments, and disturbances to authorities. Social services, unaware of the added occupants, continued routine assessments. Peter's child-minder grew alarmed. She had cared for him during his safe weeks and knew what a healthy, cheerful baby looked like. When he returned to her in the following months, he was thin, distressed, constantly bruised, and cried when lifted. She called social services repeatedly. Each call was logged. None led to action. By July, the warnings had become unmistakable. And still, nothing changed. Peter's story, now under the scrutiny of detectives, was not the story of a single bad decision or one missed sign. It was a story of professionals who saw fragments but never the whole, agencies that communicated but never coordinated, and a system built to protect children that became paralyzed under the weight of procedure, fear, and assumptions. By the time the investigation reached the final 48 hours of Peter's life, the day a doctor failed to conduct a full examination, the night before his death when charges against Tracy were officially dropped, the final chain of preventable moments had already snapped. And on August 3rd, the consequences became irrevocable. To understand how a child seen by professionals 60 times could still die unnoticed, investigators retraced every interaction Peter Connolly had with the system. What emerged was not a tale of apathy, but of fragments, pieces of the puzzle that countless people held, yet none completed. Each agency acted within its own sphere, following procedures, documenting concerns, and filing reports. But no one connected the dots. And because no one connected them, a pattern of abuse continued in plain sight. The earliest warning came when Peter was only 6 months old. Tracy brought him to the GP in September 2006, claiming he bruised easily. The doctor found faint marks on his face and chest. Nothing dramatic, nothing that couldn't be explained away with a plausible story. But Peter was too young for rough play, too small to cause such injuries on his own. The GP recorded the visit briefly and moved on to the next patient, unaware that this was only the first in a chain of escalating injuries. A month later, Tracy returned with new explanation. Peter had fallen down the stairs, yet he was only 8 months old. barely crawling, incapable of climbing steps. The GP accepted the story. He described Peter as accident-prone, a term that would later become a symbol of catastrophic misjudgment. No one challenged the physics of the explanation, the development stage of the child, or the consistency of the injuries. It was easier to assume a stressed mother than a dangerous home. By December, the situation grew more concerning. Tracy visited again, this time claiming Peter had fallen off the couch and been scratched by dogs. The bruises were darker now, more numerous, with swelling along his forehead. This time the GP hesitated. He referred Peter to Whittington Hospital for a full examination, a decision that could have changed everything. At the hospital, pediatrician Dr. Heather McKinnon conducted one of the most thorough assessments Peter would ever receive. She documented multiple bruises of different ages, swelling inconsistent with simple fall, and general conditions that suggested neglect or violence. Her recommendation was urgent and unambiguous. Peter should not be allowed home. Her report triggered police involvement. Officers interviewed Tracy and her mother, who both denied wrongdoing. Dr. McKinnon's concerns were strong enough to justify keeping Peter in protective care. Yet somewhere in exchange between hospital staff, social workers, and police, the urgency unraveled. Decisions were postponed. Risk was reframed. Sympathy took precedence over certainty. For days later, Peter was not placed in foster care or a supervised facility. He was handed to a family friend temporarily. It was a compromise meant to avoid conflict. Nobody wanted to remove the child permanently. Professionals clung to the idea that Tracy could improve with support. Within 72 hours, Tracy and her mother were arrested on suspicion of child cruelty briefly. There wasn't enough clear evidence, and they were released. Even this arrest failed to spark decisive action. On December 22nd, Peter was placed on the Child Protection Register, officially labeled at risk of significant harm. Under UK law, this designation should have triggered an aggressive response. But the caseworkers decided that monitoring would suffice. Instead of removing him, they scheduled home visits and offered advice. For 5 weeks, Peter stayed with a family friend. During those weeks, he thrived. He gained weight. His injuries healed. His behavior changed so dramatically that the friend later said the difference was like night and day. He was content, clean, playful, and eager for attention. That period proved one thing. Away from the flat on Hermitage Road, Peter could flourish. Yet January brought a decision that stunned investigators reviewing the case months later. On January 26, social services ordered Peter returned to Tracy. Case notes describe her as cooperative, emotionally improved, and responsive to guidance. They believed she understood the seriousness of the situation. But on the day he returned home, the family friend described how Peter clung to her, crying as Tracy carried him out. It was a moment unnoticed by professionals, unrecorded in files, but remembered vividly by the one person who had seen him truly safe. Within weeks, the cycle resumed. When Maria Ward became Peter's new social worker in February 2007, she arrived at the flat unaware of the full scope of the household's instability. She had inherited a stack of files, each documenting concerns but lacking clear directives. During her first visit, she walked into a home that was disorganized, unclean, and crowded with dogs. She noted the conditions in her report and encouraged Tracy to keep the environment cleaner. Tracy promised to improve. Barker, whose presence was unofficial, was not mentioned. Ward was never told he lived there. In fact, much of the household's true structure was hidden. Tracy knew that admitting Barker lived with her could jeopardize her benefits and highlight the risks to her children. So she smiled, gave excuses, and steered conversations elsewhere. Ward left that day believing she had met a struggling but willing mother. By April, that belief had shattered. Peter was rushed to North Middlesex Hospital with swelling on the side of his head. His hair was filthy, matted with dirt, crawling with lice. Tracy told doctors that another child had pushed him into the fireplace. Again, professionals documented the injuries. Again, the explanation was accepted. The idea of deliberate harm remained unspoken, even though the signs pointed to something far more calculated. Hospital staff advised Tracy to use a fire guard and supervise him more closely. It was a medical equivalent of placing a bandage over a wound that required surgery. Peter was discharged the same day. Maria Ward grew uneasy. She requested an unannounced visit in June. When she arrived, she found Peter limp and expressionless on the sofa. His body seemed drained of energy, his eyes vacant. Scattered bruises peppered his limbs. Tracy insisted he had been playing rough with another child. Ward pushed for a hospital evaluation. Doctors documented 12 marks on his face and body. 12. But after listening to Tracy's shifting explanations, and after reviewing prior medical notes, they hesitated to definitively label the injuries as abuse. Uncertainty won again. Meanwhile, tensions between agencies escalated. Social services insisted they needed stronger evidence to push for removal. Police argued they could not arrest without clear signs of deliberate harm. Each side waited for the other to say the words no one wanted to utter. This child is being tortured. The system became gridlocked by caution. In the same month, the situation inside the flat worsened dramatically. Without notifying any authorities, Jason Owen moved into the home with his teenage girlfriend and her children. Suddenly, 11 people occupied the small flat. The air grew thicker, the rooms more cramped, and the chaos more overwhelming. Peter's condition deteriorated further. His childminder and walker repeatedly phoned social services. She described alarming changes: dramatic weight loss, constant bruising, fingernails caked in dirt, the smell of vomit on his clothes, and a whimpering cry whenever he was picked up. She told social workers plainly, "Something terrible is happening to this baby." Her warnings were recorded, categorized, and filed. Nothing changed. Internally, social services convened a legal planning meeting on July 25th, a moment that could have changed history. They reviewed reports, hospital records, and medical notes. They assessed Tracy's cooperation. They debated whether Peter's case met the legal threshold for an emergency removal. They concluded it did not. Documents noted that while neglect was clear, deliberate harm was not sufficiently evidenced. No one wanted to risk removing a child on grounds that might not stand up in court. They decided the safest route was continued monitoring. Professionals comforted themselves with the idea that Tracy was engaged, that she loved her son, that she would improve. 5 days later, Maria Ward conducted her last recorded home visit. Tracy greeted her cheerfully. Peter sat on the sofa, his face smeared with chocolate. It looked odd, the coverage too heavy, but Tracy insisted he had just finished a treat. Ward asked her to clean him up for a final check. Tracy disappeared into another room and never returned. Ward waited several minutes, completed her paperwork, and left. Later, investigators would learn that the chocolate had concealed bruising. The next day, authorities officially closed the earlier neglect case against Tracy and her mother. The file was marked no further action. It was August 1st. 48 hours later, the final 2 days of Peter Connolly's life revealed the exact point where a failing system collided with the worst intentions inside that flat on Hermitage Road. For investigators reviewing the timeline years later, these hours became a narrow, suffocating corridor of missed moments, each one so preventable that reading them in order feels like watching a tragedy unfold frame by frame. It began on August 1st, 2007. That morning, an official letter arrived at Tracy Connolly's address from the Crown Prosecution Service. It confirmed what she had anticipated for months. The neglect charges brought against her during the December investigations were being dropped. The warning signs documented late the previous year, bruises, swelling, suspicious injuries, were now rendered legally insufficient. Tracy's reaction reportedly bordered on celebratory. She phoned friends, told neighbors she had been proved right, and insisted that the authorities had misunderstood her all along. Behind the scenes, social workers closed the file regarding those earlier concerns. The case had already been marked inactive. The letter simply stamped finality on the decision. But while paperwork was being settled and professionals took temporary comfort in bureaucratic closure, the reality inside the flat was deteriorating. On August 1st, Peter was taken to St. Anne's Hospital in Haringey. The visit placed him, unknowingly, before the last medical professional who would ever see him alive. His appointment was handled by a locum doctor, Dr. Sabah Al-Zayed, who was covering an overbooked clinic. The regular pediatrician wasn't available. The corridors were crowded. Parents waited with restless children, and the clinic was running behind schedule. When Peter was placed on the table, Al-Zayed recorded that he appeared underweight, feverish, and irritable. He whimpered when touched and cried when she examined his ears. His limbs were stiff, but she attributed this to distress. His face was smeared with remnants of food or possibly chocolate. No one noted the bruises hidden beneath. Her examination remained cursory. She later said she feared causing him further upset by conducting a full physical inspection. She concluded he had a mild infection. She advised rest and fluids. She sent him home. For investigators who later read her notes, this moment became the last exit ramp. One that could have saved his life had a complete examination been performed. But the decision was made, the paperwork completed, and the cycle continued. Peter was carried out of the hospital and back into a home that had already failed him repeatedly. Inside the flat, tensions were rising. The overcrowding had reached a breaking point. 11 people shared the rooms. Tracy, her 4 children, Barker, Owen, Owen's teenage girlfriend, and her 3 children. The space was cramped, chaotic, and filthy. The large dogs roamed freely. Piles of clothes and decaying household waste filled corners. And in the midst of this environment was a toddler who had become increasingly frail. Investigators later learned that during these final days, Peter suffered injuries so severe that medical experts struggled to determine which trauma had killed him and when. They found evidence of fractured ribs, spinal damage, and internal bleeding. Some injuries were older, some recent. The violence had not been sudden. It had been sustained. But none of those details were yet known on August 1st. Professionals had assured themselves that monitoring was enough. Tracy had assured them she was coping. Every adult inside the home assured the world that nothing was wrong. And so the flat continued as it always had. On August 2nd, the day before the emergency call, witnesses remembered Tracy behaving with an eerie sense of normalcy. She made phone calls, chatted with neighbors, and mentioned casually that Peter had been fussy during the night. She told one person he might have a cold. Another recalled her saying he was just tired. The sore throat she described to Dr. Al-Zayed was repeated to others. No one sensed the urgency. That afternoon, Barker and Owen were seen leaving flat, carrying bags and bedding. At the time, their departure didn't raise alarms. Later, police would discover those bags contained Peter's clothes and items stained with bodily fluids, what investigators would believe were attempts to conceal evidence. Throughout the day, Tracy appeared a circle between agitation and relief. Agitated by the demands of her household, relieved by the dismissal of her legal charges. She mentioned the CPS letter to at least one neighbor with a tone of vindication. Meanwhile, Peter's condition worsened. Medical examiners would later describe the injuries he sustained in those final hours as catastrophic. He likely cried until he could no longer muster the strength. His breathing became shallow. His eyes lost focus. He drifted in and out of consciousness. His spine injury alone would have made movement unbearable. This was the point where the slightest intervention, one phone call, one emergency visit, one neighbor insisting something was wrong, might have changed the ending. But the adults inside that flat either ignored or concealed his suffering. No outside agency was alerted. No one came. August 3rd began without urgency for anyone except Peter. Tracy claimed she checked on him sometime before midday. Some accounts suggest she believed he was sleeping. Others indicate she may have known something was terribly wrong, but hesitated before calling for help. What is undisputed is that by the time she dialed emergency services at 11:35 a.m., Peter was already beyond saving. When paramedics entered the room, they found him cold to the touch, wearing only a nappy. Rigor mortis had begun, meaning he had been dead for some time, possibly hours. The paramedic who attempted CPR did so out of procedure, not hope. The environment around the cot was squalid. The smell of waste lingered in the air. One paramedic later recalled seeing human excrement on the wall near the cot. The scene told a story no words could soften. Yet in the middle of this chaos, Tracy asked if she could bring her cigarettes with her. The paramedics noted her request. not as condemnation, but because it didn't match the situation unfolding around her. At the hospital, doctors performed a final attempt at resuscitation, but at 12:19 p.m., they signed the certificate. Peter Connolly, deceased. The cause of death was unclear, but the signs pointed unmistakably toward prolonged violence. Detectives arrived quickly. Tracy was taken into custody for questioning. Her responses were inconsistent, oscillating between confusion, denial, and deflection. Meanwhile, Barker and Owen were nowhere to be found. Their disappearance immediately shifted the investigation from a suspicious death to a potential homicide. Over the next days, police reviewed Tracy's phone records, interrogated neighbors, and pieced together last sightings of the two men. When officers reached the flat again, they found evidence suggesting deliberate efforts to clean, remove, and obscure critical items. 11 days later, Barker and Owen were discovered camping in Epping Forest, living in a tent filled with weapons, knives, crossbows, and makeshift protective tools. Their arrest was quiet but decisive. They offered little explanation. Back in London, a post-mortem examination was ordered at Great Ormond Street Hospital. The findings left every professional who had ever worked with Peter confronted with a single, devastating truth. They had missed their chance. Multiple fractures, old injuries layered over new ones, spinal damage consistent with violent force, internal bleeding, bruising across nearly every region of his body, some fresh, some faded, all pointing to repeated harm. The report was not just clinical documentation. It was a final indictment of a system that had been warned repeatedly and failed repeatedly. When investigators compared those injuries to the timeline of social worker visits, medical appointments, and police interventions, they realized something chilling. Nearly every injury occurred during a period when Peter was supposedly being monitored. He had not slipped through cracks. He had been visible the entire time. And still, no one saved him. By the time the case reached the Old Bailey in late 2008, the story of a small boy from North London had already become a national wound. Crowds gathered outside the courthouse lawn before proceedings began, driven by a mixture of sorrow, anger, and disbelief. Inside, reporters filled every available seat. Security was heightened. Emotions ran high. And three defendants, Tracy Connolly, Stephen Barker, and Jason Owen, sat behind bulletproof glass, their faces lit by the dull glow of courtroom lights as lawyers prepared to unravel a timeline that had outraged the country. The prosecution opened with the medical findings. The post-mortem report cataloged injuries so extensive that even seasoned professionals hesitated when reading them aloud. Fractured ribs in various stages of healing, spinal damage caused by forceful bending, bruises that spread across nearly every region of the toddler's body, torn skin, internal bleeding, evidence of repeated harm delivered over time. Not in a single moment of violence. It was clear the abuse spanned months, hidden beneath explanations that had never been challenged strongly enough. As jurors listened, the question many had carried into the room deepened. How did a child seen by so many professionals end up this damaged without intervention strong enough to save him? The prosecution presented a timeline of agency involvement, more than 60 points of contact with police, doctors, nurses, social workers, and child protection teams. Nothing had stopped the escalation. Every visit, appointment, and warning had become part of the broader failure. Attention then turned to Tracy Connolly. Her legal team described her as a mother shaped by neglect, instability, and years of emotional abandonment. They argued that she was vulnerable, intimidated by Barker, and unable to protect her children against his control. They referenced her turbulent upbringing, her dependence on male attention, and her attempts to convince social workers she could manage. But the prosecution countered with evidence showing deception, avoidance, and repeated opportunities to intervene that she did not take. Records showed she had given inconsistent explanations about Peter's injuries, concealed Barker's presence at home to avoid scrutiny, and maintained normal routines even while her son's condition visibly deteriorated. Partway through the proceedings, Tracy changed her plea to guilty. She admitted she had failed to protect her child and acknowledged she had allowed the environment where the abuse unfolded. The plea did not clarify who inflicted each injury, nor did it provide closure, but it confirmed her role in the chain of neglect. For the public, her admission brought little comfort. Outside the court, Headlines condemned her as one of the most reviled mothers in modern British history. Stephen Barker sat rigid as the case against him unfolded. Witnesses described him as volatile, cruel, and controlling, someone who had harmed animals for amusement, kept weapons in the home, and used intimidation to exert authority. Investigators have found signs of his influence throughout the flat. Medical testimony indicated that several injuries required significant strength to inflict. Though no witness could say they saw Barker harm Peter directly, the pattern of timing and severity aligned with periods when Barker was present and Tracy's children were under his supervision. The court heard evidence about his past: violence, manipulation, cruelty. The conclusion drawn by the prosecution was simple and chilling. Whether he inflicted the injuries himself or permitted them to happen, he had contributed to the suffering inside that home. The jury found him guilty. Jason Owen's involvement was subtler, but no less significant. He had moved into the home only months before the baby's death, yet his presence added another layer of neglect and disorder. He saw the conditions. He lived amid the chaos, and he was directly involved in fleeing the property on August 2nd, carrying bags filled with Peter's clothes, items later determined to be potential evidence. When police arrested him at a campsite in Epping Forest, they found knives, crossbows, and makeshift shelters, suggesting an attempt to disappear. To the prosecution, Owen's silence was not ignorance. It was complicity. The jury convicted him as well. Once the verdicts were announced, attention shifted to sentencing. Tracy Connolly received an indefinite sentence with a minimum of 5 years before eligibility for parole. Barker was given a life sentence with a minimum of 10 years, along with an additional 12 years for an unrelated assault on a 2-year-old girl. The sentences were set to run concurrently. Jason Owen received an indefinite sentence with a minimum of 3 years, later reduced on appeal to a fixed 6-year term. To the public, these outcomes felt inadequate. In the streets outside the courtroom, people demanded harsher consequences. Many felt that the system had failed again, this time not in protecting the child, but in delivering justice equal to the scale of the suffering he endured. While the criminal proceedings closed one chapter, they opened another. The government launched a full inquiry into the handling of the case. Child Protection Services in Haringey came under immediate fire. Reports revealed that multiple warnings had been ignored or downplayed. Information had not been properly shared between agencies. Urgent concerns had been softened by cautious interpretation, and decisions that should have been made decisively were repeatedly postponed. The inquiry concluded with a damning assessment. The head of Haringey's Children's Services, Sharon Shoesmith, was dismissed. Several senior officials faced disciplinary action. Nationwide, hundreds of similar cases were reviewed as counsel scrambled to ensure they were not harboring another unseen tragedy. Social workers spoke anonymously to press, describing overwhelming caseloads, institutional pressure, and fear of making the wrong call. Medical staff defended their actions while acknowledging that earlier intervention was possible. Police departments revised their internal guidelines for child protection responses. Even with reforms underway, the public felt that systemic change was moving too slowly. Parents, advocacy groups, and child welfare experts argued that the case reflected deep-rooted issues: an overburdened system, fear of being wrongfully accused, reluctance to remove children from parents, and chronic underfunding that left frontline workers exhausted. Throughout the country, the photo of a smiling toddler with blonde curls circulated on newspapers and television screens. He had been known only as Baby P during the trial to protect his identity, yet his image became a symbol of the consequences of hesitation. For many, the tragedy was not solely defined by the cruelty of the individuals responsible, but by the number of adults who had seen signs of danger and failed to intervene decisively. As the courtroom emptied for final time and the press began its post-trial analysis, one fact lingered above every headline. The abuse had not been invisible. It had been visible to dozens of professionals, each of whom had acted within their own isolated role. The system had been consulted, notified, and informed repeatedly, yet no one connected the scattered observations into a single, urgent truth. By the end of 2008, the trial had concluded, but the national reckoning had only begun. The case forced Britain to confront painful questions about responsibility, accountability, and the unseen children behind closed doors. The verdicts delivered justice according to the law, But the story of baby Peter continued to reshape the country's understanding of child protection long after the defendants were taken from the courtroom and the gallery went quiet. The verdicts were handed down. The sentences were read. The courtroom emptied. Yet the story of Peter Connolly refused to settle into the archives of tragedy. In the months and years that followed, the case became a mirror held up to an entire nation, a reflection of systems stretched thin, professionals burdened by caution, and a society forced to confront the uncomfortable truth that the worst harm sometimes occurs in the most familiar places. The immediate aftermath brought widespread reform efforts and intense scrutiny. Officials across every child protection agency faced questions that could not be dodged. How had so many professionals, across so many disciplines, failed to see the full picture? Why had concerns raised by doctors, nurses, child menders, and even police officers not triggered decisive intervention? Why had a toddler in clear distress been returned home repeatedly, each time more damaged than before? Government inquiries began almost as soon as the trial ended. Haringey Council, already implicated in previous child protection failures, found itself at the center of national outrage. Investigators reviewing the timeline discovered a staggering list of misjudgments and procedural gaps. Incomplete risk assessments, insufficient communication between agencies, over-reliance on a mother's self-reporting, and decisions shaped by fear of overstepping rather than fear of underreacting. In the official findings, leadership at the council was criticized for failing to create a culture where decisive action was both supported and expected. Sharon Shoesmith, the head of Children's Services, was dismissed. More than a dozen senior officials faced disciplinary hearings. But even the most severe administrative consequences felt, to the public, like an incomplete reckoning. Many believed the failures extended far beyond Haringey. No single council, no single hospital, no single police team could hold responsibility for a collapse that, in reality, was systemic. During this period, hospitals conducted their own internal reviews. Doctors who had assessed Peter prior to his death described the difficulty of working with incomplete information. GPs explained that bruising and accidents in toddlers were not unusual on their own, and without full access to social service notes, they did not know the frequency or severity of previous injuries. Pediatricians admitted they should have pushed harder, escalated more urgently, insisted more forcefully. Some expressed personal guilt for not acting on instincts they now recognize as valid. The Metropolitan Police also issued a formal apology, acknowledging that their involvement had been inconsistent. Officers had responded to calls, made notes, and followed procedural requirements, but they had not enforced protective orders aggressively enough. They also admitted that the December arrest of Tracy and her mother should have led to a much deeper investigation. Instead, once released on bail, both women slipped back into the same environment, and the opportunity for protective intervention disappeared. The public's anger did not subside. Protests formed outside government buildings. Editorials in major newspapers demanded sweeping reforms. The image of the smiling toddler, known legally as Baby P, dominated front pages for months. For many, the case became a symbol of the consequences of institutional hesitation. Behind these national conversations, Peter's family faced their own private aftermath. His biological father, who had been largely absent from a public narrative for legal reasons, chose not to engage with media coverage. He focused instead on caring for his remaining children, Peter's 3 sisters. Friends later said he felt crushed by a grief too large for words and avoided interviews or statements because reliving the timeline was unbearable. He left his job to raise the girls full-time, determined to create the stability that had been denied to his son. The girls themselves grew up with counseling and support, shielded from media coverage as much as possible. Professionals worked to keep their identities private, fearing the lasting impact of their brother's story. Their lives became an example of another kind of child protection, one that aims to preserve normalcy after trauma rather than before it. Meanwhile, the 3 adults convicted in Peter's death moved through the justice system in different ways. Jason Owen was released in 2011 after serving only 6 years of his revised sentence. He was given a new identity. His release was met with renewed public outrage, exacerbated when news emerged 2 years later that he had been recalled to prison for violating parole conditions. Reports suggested he had been working under an alias, attempting to reintegrate while concealing his past. Tracy Connolly's path was even more turbulent. Released in 2013 after serving her minimum term, she was recalled to prison in 2015 for breaking parole conditions, including allegations of selling indecent images online. Her repeated attempts at parole between 2017 and 2021 were denied on the grounds that she still lacked insight into her role in the abuse. When she was released again in 2022, strict measures were imposed: an electronic tag, a curfew, psychological monitoring, and restrictions designed to limit her interactions with children. Even then, public reaction remained intense. And by 2024, she was recalled once more, her inability to comply with conditions reinforcing public skepticism about her rehabilitation. Stephen Barker remained in prison, serving his life sentence along with the additional years for assaulting another child. His parole applications were repeatedly denied. Reports from prison staff described him as uncooperative, unremorseful, and resistant to rehabilitation programs. There was little indication he would ever be released. These outcomes did not satisfy the nation. For many, the sentences felt disconnected from the magnitude of the harm inflicted. The idea that any of the individuals involved could one day walk free felt like an affront to memory of a child whose life had been marked by suffering from its earliest weeks. As the years passed, the Baby Peter case continued to reshape child protection policies. Training programs were revamped to focus on early identification of cumulative harm. Multi-agency communication protocols were strengthened so medical professionals, police officers, and social workers could access shared records in real time. Some councils implemented rapid response teams for high-risk cases, trained to override bureaucratic delays. Yet even with new protocols, deeper problems lingered. Studies conducted several years after the case revealed a shift in social work culture, one driven not by confidence, but by fear. Workers expressed increased anxiety about missing another Baby P case. Some described feeling pressured to remove children preemptively to avoid being blamed for inaction. Others reported hesitancy in their decision-making due to fear of making the wrong call in the opposite direction. The balance between protecting children and preserving families had become even more fraught. Within child protection agencies, some professionals argued that while the Baby Peter reforms were necessary, they did not address core issues: chronic understaffing, overwhelming caseloads, limited training resources, and high turnover. They insisted that meaningful reform required long-term investment, not reactive restructuring. Critics pointed out that the system still operated on the edge of collapse in many areas, sometimes held together only by the dedication of individual social workers who were stretched far beyond sustainable limits. For the public, the case became a permanent reference point, a benchmark against which every subsequent child protection failure was measured. News articles about other tragedies frequently mentioned Baby P, reflecting the lasting impact of his story on collective memory. His face, once a symbol of innocence, became a reminder of systemic vulnerability. Over time, the official documents, the trial transcripts, and inquiry reports settled into archives, but the essential question remained unresolved. How does a society protect the most vulnerable children when the mechanisms designed to safeguard them buckle under pressure, caution, and conflicting priorities? The answer was complex, and the case provided no easy resolution. What it did provide was clarity, a painful reminder that systems fail not only because they're flawed, but because they depend on people making difficult decisions in uncertain conditions. And when those decisions are delayed, softened, or avoided entirely, the consequences can be catastrophic. As years passed, the story of Baby Peter remained a symbol of grief and accountability. It prompted reforms, toppled careers, shattered public trust, and forced a national conversation about the cost of hesitation. But beneath the policy changes and public debates, his story returned again and again to one simple, devastating truth: a child cannot wait for systems to catch up. Protection delayed is protection denied. His life, brief and filled with warning signs, reshaped the landscape of child welfare across the United Kingdom. His death became a reminder etched into institutional memory, a warning that vigilance is not optional, and that the smallest voices often speak to quiet signs adults cannot afford to ignore. And though the legal proceedings have ended and the headlines have faded, The ghost of this case continues to linger in every decision made by those entrusted with child safety. For every worker, doctor, nurse, and officer who encounters a vulnerable child, the question echoes still. Will this be another chance missed? Will the